2021 was a great year for BMW, but especially its M division, which saw sales rise by over 13%. Now, while the M3 and M4 likely lead the charge on those sales, performance SUVs and crossovers are taking a bigger slice of that pie each year, which makes the vehicle I've been testing this week particularly interesting because it is the 2022 BMW X4M competition. Now, new for 22, there are a bunch of updates that I think make this a better performance crossover, but does that mean you should still buy it over an M3, over an M4? Let's find out. Now, before we start talking about X3Ms, X4Ms, M3s, M4s, I think it's important to note that I have spent ample time with the M3 competition, both on the road and on track. So I think I have a very good feel of how this platform behaves and just how it performs overall. And frankly, this is the very first X4 I've ever driven, so what a way to get into it with the X4M competition. New for 22, there are a bunch of updates in the styling and design department, so why not start there? This mid-cycle refresh gives us larger kidney grills and intakes throughout. In fact, the front bumper now allows much more air to flow through, largely to feed the main and side radiators hiding within it. There's even a separate oil and transmission cooler up front, so this refresh is equal parts form and function. In the rear, the changes are more subtle, with a redesigned bumper that features a more aggressive diffuser that extends into a large gloss black trim piece. Lastly, my tester featured blackout exhaust tips that nicely completed the X4M's sporty aesthetic. There's no getting around the fact that the X4M is a coupe-style SUV. However, subtle tweaks to its exterior make it work quite well. While my personal favorite is its sibling, the X3M, it doesn't win by much. Next, let's move on to one of the main reasons why anyone would buy an X4M competition, that being the 3-liter twin turbocharged straight sticks that lives under the hood in front. For 2022, there's even more power. The X4M competition now puts out 503 horsepower and over 470 foot-pounds of torque, which is a lot. Despite the fact that this is a crossover that weighs over 4,600 pounds, it still feels incredibly fast. 0 to 60 is under 4 seconds, which it wasn't previously, and that's because of the added torque. Now, in order to get a lot of those performance benefits, BMW has reworked the internals of this engine, fortifying it in order to obviously produce more power. In terms of power delivery, this engine is an absolute monster. I loved it when I drove it in the M3 competition, especially on track. There is a tremendous amount of torque, and put your foot down in basically any gear and it takes off. You know, 500 horsepower in today's world may not seem like a lot, but trust me, it is. And even like I mentioned, in a 4,600 pound crossover, it still freaking flies. It is an absolute rocket ship. And it's surprising how something this kind of big and heavy can really take off that quickly. Sending that power to the wheels is now a traditional automatic transmission, no more dual clutch. Now, I was very skeptical of that the first time I stepped into one of these newer BMWs, but after driving a couple of them, it's really not a problem. This transmission is more than fast enough to keep up with this engine. Maybe it lacks some of the crispness in terms of downshifts than the dual clutch delivered, but in terms of performance, I think it's 95% of the way there. And frankly, I don't think most people are going to miss the dual clutch, if I'm honest. Around town, it's incredibly smooth, especially when you start messing around with all the driving modes and such. It's very, very civilized, and frankly, since that's where most people are going to drive this most of the time, I'm glad that it nails that department. But even up here in its most aggressive setting, we're in track mode right now, very quick to respond on both upshift and downshift, but like I mentioned, lacking just a little bit of that crispness. Unlike its M3 and M4 siblings, the X4M competition comes standard with all-wheel drive, although it is a rear drive biased system. Does it feel like you're driving a rear-wheel drive vehicle? I would argue not really. The one thing that I really love about it being all-wheel drive is that you can really point and squirt the power wherever you want, and you don't have to worry about wheel spin or anything. M3 competition with traction off, you know, rear drive, it can get a little hairy. That car likes it. It is a little bit tail happy, but this again is a little bit more docile because it's just put your foot down in any gear and you have grip, grip, grip. Now, I think it's time we move on to one of the things that I really I really wanted to love about this car, but I have been let down a little bit, and I think that is the suspension department. Now, I don't know if you can tell from that camera in front of me, but I have been bouncing around a little bit as I come down this mountain, and that is because the suspension in the X4M competition is very, very stiff. Now, I understand why it's stiff, because, well, if you want a crossover to perform and to manage all of that body roll, you really are gonna need stiffer suspension to keep it in check. And I totally agree with that. That's why we have adaptive dampers. Now, up here, it's a little bit bouncy, it's very tight, but it does allow this crossover to stay incredibly planted. Even at very, very high speed cornering, super duper planted and just frankly quite docile. However, around town, when you put it in a comfort mode where you kind of want a softer suspension, you really want to just, you know, go around town quite comfortably, this car does not have the dual personality that I really wish it did. Around town, it's quite stiff. It's quite stiff and bouncy, and you feel just about every bump. It kind of judders in the interior. Up here, I'm glad it's stiff because of the performance. Around town, not so much. Now, the steering has good feel. It is a variable ratio, which is kind of quick. I noted that in the M3 as well, but good feel. I think it's very precise, and frankly, you can definitely tell that as a crossover, like what I mentioned with the suspension, this is definitely leaning more on the sporty side than it is on the sort of comfortable crossover side. This is a very performance-based, performance-focused vehicle. Can't talk about a performance SUV without talking about the brakes, because the X4M competition has phenomenal brakes. They're big, they're ventilated, and they do a great job of stopping this enormous crossover. They are more than up to the task, and frankly, up here, I've been beating on them for hours at a time while doing filming and B-roll and everything, and they just hold on for dear life and perform. Now let's talk about the interior, because this is a very nice place to be. It's identical, basically, to that of the X3M, and very similar to the M3 and M4. BMW is no stranger to making high quality interiors, and this is, you know, a good example of that. You have great stitching in the seats, great contrasting stitching throughout. In general, this cabin just feels really nicely appointed, and we have carbon fiber trim. The digital instrument cluster in front of me, like I mentioned earlier in the driving modes, very adjustable, and you can configure it to kind of show you exactly the information you want. Right now, I'm looking at the PSI in my tires and the temperature, which is nice to know, especially when you're in the canyon, just kind of beating on it repeatedly and repeatedly. Big digital screen in the middle. This does have wireless Apple CarPlay and wireless Android Auto, which is especially helpful, you know, having that phone connectivity, and it's really easy to use. Frankly, the iDrive system, the current generation of iDrive, I find very easy to use. It's very sleek. I love the color scheme. It looks very modern, and frankly, honestly, I have no complaints with it. Frankly, this just feels like a interior from a brand that has been doing this for a very, very long time. The ergonomics are good, the material choices are good, and even the design is good. There's nothing revolutionary going on here. This is a very, you know, sort of similar interior you see in many of its competitors and just many vehicles in this class, but this is just executed really, really well.
On the pricing side, a base X4M starts at $74,395. However, opt for the competition package and that price balloons to just over $80,000. As tested, we're looking at a figure of just over $86,000, putting it closely in line with the cost of its sedan and coupe siblings. Frankly, pricing won't be a big deciding factor between choosing an M3 or M4 over this. However, what makes all the difference is the extra available space, which came very handy over the last week while lugging groceries and even my bicycle. While the M3 is still my choice for the one to drive, the X4 or even the X3M are undoubtedly the better options to live with.
And with that, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because it helps us grow and it helps me bring you more cool cars and videos of cool cars. Speaking of which, if you want to see any particular new vehicle, model, brand, or anything, leave it in the comments and I will do my best to get that for you. But until then, my name is Gabriel, and I'll see you on the next one.